The lesson is from Daniel chapter 1. And our book outlined it like this. The world wants to squeeze believers into its mold. Daniel 1, 1 through 7. Believers do what pleases God instead of what culture dictates. Verses 8 through 16. And God uses believers for his glory when they choose to honor him. Verses 17 through 21. Kind of to get some background of where you're at when you open the book of Daniel. And this may be a little more information than you want to know. In 612 BC, Nineveh falls to the Babylonians and their allies. 609 BC, this is in Bible. Josiah attempts to stop Pharaoh Necho as he is going to join the Assyrians at Haran as they battle the Babylonians. This delay of Necho and Josiah having their battle at Megiddo may have aided the Babylonians and Medes in their defeat of the Assyrians. So Necho II returns. Josiah dies in this battle, but Necho goes on to Haran. He gets there late, but when he returns to Egypt, he removes Jehoahaz as king of Jerusalem. So basically, Jerusalem, Judea, has become under the control of Judah. Judah has become under the control of Egypt. So, he enthrones Jehoiakim, or Eliakim, as the king of Judah in Jerusalem from 609 to 598. In 605, there's another battle with the last remnants of the Assyrian Empire and the Egyptians and the Babylonians. Again, the Babylonians are successful. This time, Babylonians come to do the paperwork in Judea. Egypt lost. So Judah falls under the control of the Babylonians. So King Jehoiakim becomes a vassal king. He is taxed. Prominent citizens are taken to Babylon. And part of the temple vessels are taken to Babylon. This is where we are in the opening of the book of Daniel, Daniel chapter 1. There's things that are discussed Daniel says 3 years. Jeremiah says it's the 4th year. So which is it? Well, that may be explained by 2 different calendar systems. The calendar system that is used in Judah and the calendar system that is used in Babylon. Daniel is in Babylon most of his life. He is in Babylon from the beginning of the captivity until Cyrus the king and the Persian king, the Persian Empire. So that's where we are. Remember that in Isaiah chapter 39, verses 1 through 8, Isaiah prophesied that some of King Hezekiah's descendants would go to Babylon. And you might want to look that up for a moment. And that's also found in 2 Kings 20, verses 12 through 19.
Please say the Isaiah.
Isaiah 39, 1 through 8. Isaiah 39, 1 through 8. So, the previous chapter, Hezekiah is sick. He's told that he is going to die, and he recovers. He's given 15 more years. Verse 39 chapter 39 opens with a visit from emissaries from the king of Babylon. And Hezekiah shows him everything in his household, all his treasures. He shows him the temple treasures. And Isaiah says, you weren't wise. In verse 5, he says, then Isaiah said to Hezekiah, hear the word of the Lord of hosts. Days are coming when all that is in your house and that which your ancestors have stored up until this day shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, says the Lord. Some of your own sons who are born to you shall be taken away. They shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. Then Hezekiah said to Isaiah, the word of the Lord that you have spoken is good, for he thought there will be peace and security in my days. So, 605 is the beginning. Judah becomes a vassal state of Babylon. Daniel and his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that's their Babylonian names, are taken to Babylon. 597, 598 BC. Ezekiel, it goes to Babylon, and more citizens of Jerusalem. Then in 586 BC, Babylon destroys Jerusalem and burns the temple. So, like I said, that's probably more information than you wanted to know. But notice that who let this happen? God let this happen. And I probably need to point out there's probably not much of a siege in 605. One commentator said it was just a matter of paperwork. It's going, the Babylonians come, they say, Egypt is no longer your overlord, we are. Now deal with it. You'll be taxed. You got to give some of your prominent citizens. And that was kind of a thing. If you send prominent citizens to Babylon, you might not have as great of a tendency to rebel. So it's just a matter of paperwork, if you will. So God allows this to happen. Why does God allow this to happen?
You know, Greg, you use the word allows this to happen. I like to use the word God's communicating.
Okay, God's communicating. And what is he communicating? Sin.
They're idolatry.
Their idolatry. There is a passage that talks about the sins of Manasseh filling the city with innocent blood. There is a passage in the book of Jeremiah that talks about idolatry. There is a passage that talks about they did not keep the sabbatical years. They did not release the slaves when they were supposed to. And there was a time when they pretended they were during the prophecies of Jeremiah. But then within weeks later, or maybe not that long, they got the slaves back. God wasn't happy with that. So they were not living by the law that God gave them through Moses. They were not living by the law God gave them through Moses. Many of your versions may say that the temple vessels were taken to what?
They were put in the treasure house of Nebuchadnezzar's
God. And where does it say he took them? I'm just interested in that from your versions. Huh?
Babylonian.
Okay. Any of you have the word Shinar? The plain of Shinar. Yeah. Okay. That's important. You go back to Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 through 9, and Genesis 10, 6 through 10. Shinar is where Babylon will originate. The Tower of Babel is at. That is the beginning of the kingdom of Nimrod. It is, and in Zechariah 5, verse 11, wickedness is taken to Shinar. This is everything that's opposed to God. Nebuchadnezzar puts these vessels in the temple of his God. And there's a reason for him doing that. It's basically saying, my God's greater than your God. And I can show you. I've got his stuff. But all the while, we're back to verse 2. The Lord let this happen. So in verses 3, we meet the palace master or command, Ashpenaz, and he is to bring some of the royal family, the nobility of the Israelites. And they're to be trained. Now, where are they to be trained as? Administrators.
History, everything about the Babylonian Empire.
They're to become Babylonians. They're to be forced into being Babylonians in a way. They're to be molded as Babylonians. First thing they do, or one of the first things they do, is change their names. The endings L and IAH in Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah all connect the names to the Jewish God, Yahweh. or Elohim. Their names are connected with their God. Daniel means God is my judge. Hananiah, the Lord shows grace. Mishael, who is what God is. Azariah, the Lord helps. So they're given new names, Babylonian names. Daniel is given the name Belteshazzar, which may mean he whom Bel favors. Bel seems to be another name for Marduk. Shadrach means under the command of Aku, the moon god. Meshach, who is what Aku is. And Azariah becomes Abednego, which probably means the servant of Nebo, the god of wisdom. Now, as you read commentaries and other stuff, you may find the names have different meanings, especially the Babylonian names. But notice that they're downplaying the connection that they had to their Jewish God. They're connecting them with the Babylonian gods. These young men and others were to be educated in everything Babylonian. I mean, they were to be taught what the Babylonians knew. They were to be taught the literature of the Babylonians, probably the Akkadian language. These young men, as being part of the royal family, may have already known Aramaic, which was becoming a diplomatic language of the times. So they may not need much training in that. So they would know the Akkadian script, how to write it. They would probably become familiar, even fluent, with that language. And we probably need to think about this for a moment. Was it just the general education of scribal training where there was a wide range of literature? Or was it specialized literature that they were being trained in? And the literature that was used by the diviners, the astrologers, and it may have been both, especially for Daniel. What does Daniel have the ability to do? Interpret dreams. And they paid a lot of attention to the interpretation of dreams. They would know about the theology of the Babylonians, their concept of humans and gods, the great gods, Anu, the king of the gods, God of fresh waters, wisdom and creators, Enu, Enel, rather, the Fates. So they would learn all of this. Probably the Epic of Gilgamesh would be something that they would learn. They would learn mathematics. There's even stuff in mathematics that we use today that's from the Babylonians. Our clock, the measurement of a circle, all based on the idea of a system of numbers based on 60. Science, astronomy, astrology, algebra. They were to be trained in all of these things to be servants of the king. And again, we're engulfing you in Babylonian thought. Education does the same thing today. It's one of the ways that we instill culture and worldview. It's never neutral. It's always transmitting a philosophy and beliefs to students. It's not neutral. Now, notice that Daniel and his friends have no objections to the name change. They have no objection to learning about Babylon. But when it comes to eating the foods of Babylon, they object. Now, there are probably other Judeans there, but we only have record of these 4 objecting. Why this scruple? Why this one? We can do a lot of speculation, but we may not really know. Obviously, we think of the food laws from Leviticus 11. Foods that you should eat, should not eat. There's probably included on this menu things like pork and horse. Maybe the food wasn't killed correctly, so there was blood still in it. That's another thing from Leviticus. Maybe it wasn't stored correctly. Maybe it wasn't cooked correctly. Maybe a kid was cooked in its mother's milk. Strangled. Yeah. So, that's one possibility. The food laws. Maybe it was because of the association with the idols. And again, that one may have more problem than some of the others, because that may be exporting a New Testament problem into this situation that wasn't there. Ezekiel 4:13 and Hosea 9:3 may imply that all foods in exile were unclean. And notice I said may imply. I'm not sure I buy what I was reading. There may be this idea. To eat one's food is to be in allegiance to the one who supplies it, dependent upon that person And so Daniel, and this is not even a good argument either, because they were still dependent on the good graces of the king for their very life, really. But perhaps the idea is they wanted to resist being lured into the comforts of Babylon. Think about it. These meals were probably really good. Probably had some exotic things to eat. And maybe Judeans didn't typically eat. Prepared well. But they were being lured into the comfort of Babylon. And this was one area that they could resist in the process of assimilation. They could retain their identity. They may not have been able to retain their name. They had to learn Babylonian literature and science. But even then, those ideas couldn't separate them from their God, because they knew who they were. They knew who they were. And it's not even sure that Daniel followed this approach his whole life. In Daniel 10, chapter 2, he gives up good foods and drink for another time period. But notice that Daniel and his friends purposed in their heart not to defile themselves. They respectfully asked not to defile themselves. Ashpenaz had a legitimate concern. He said, I fear the king. And if you guys don't look right, I may be in trouble. And let's not forget, Nebuchadnezzar could be trouble. Remember that when Zedekiah, the last king of Judah, the punishment that he inflicted on him, he brought him before him. He brought all of Zedekiah's children before him. He killed them, and then he poked out Zedekiah's eyes. Now, another passage in the book of Jeremiah suggests that he roasted people alive. And then, of course, next week, you have that famous story. So he had legitimate reason to be afraid. But Daniel was persistent. He asked the guard that was placed over him, not Ashpenaz, but the guard. And they worked out a deal. He proposed a test for 10 days. And perhaps the guard got better food from this deal than he was ordinarily getting. And he asked for vegetables and water. This is mainly seeds, grains, to eat. He didn't endanger Ashpenaz. He didn't endanger the guard, and God rewarded them. Daniel, as we will see, is counselor directly to the king as we read the rest of the book. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego become officials in Babylon. But notice that in verse 19, and the king spoke with them, and among them all, no one was found to compare with Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore, they were all stationed in the king's court. The others were just assigned duties in the state, but these were in the king's court. Daniel will be there for the whole of 70 years, practically. This passage can show us some things. This is a passage that talks about from John 17, verses 15 through 16, where God's people are in the world, but not of the world. Daniel and his friends are not going to be the Romans 12 passage that Josh is looking at. Romans 12, 1 and 2 talks about not being conformed to the world, but being transformed by the renewing of your mind. Daniel and his friends probably were influenced first, probably by their parents. But they also had 3 prophets that they could listen to: Jeremiah, Habakkuk, and Zephaniah. So in that sense, maybe the prophets were successful. And this is where, we need to be in the world, but not of the world. We need to be a people that are not conformed to our world. And we need to remember that we are living in exile. We're living in exile. Where does Philippians 3:20 say our home is? Our citizenship is? Heaven. So we need to know how to live in exile. According to Jeremiah 29, verses 4 through 7, they were to be good citizens in Babylon. But they were to remember, this is not your home. And as part of living in exile, we need to be discerning. There are things that are always morally wrong, and we need to know that. Right? There are things that are always morally right. We need to know that. And then there are things that are kind of indifferent. And we need to know when we need to be a little bit different on those. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? I'm not sure it does. And last point, and this probably comes up better in the next one on Daniel. We need to be willing to say no, even if it costs us everything. Daniel said no in this chapter. He said, no, I'm not going to become lured into the comforts of Babylon by eating his food. Questions, comments?
I think it's interesting, Greg, and, the Babylonians did all this education. Verse 17 said God gave these men knowledge, understanding, every kind of riches.
Yes.
God used what the Babylonians were teaching his Lord.
Yes. And this will be a theme throughout the book. God used, as Mike pointed out, what the Babylonians were teaching for Daniel to be God's servant.
Romans 8:28.
Yeah, made the best deal out of it. Now, I didn't emphasize this, but these guys probably somewhere in the age range of 13 to 17 years old when this starts. And Daniel lives into his 90s, probably, in exile. Any other questions, comments?
One thing I was thinking, Greg, being, those 4 being so young, fruit and wine. If you start, if they started going in that, it might, if they get more comfortable, they start creating more associations with the Babylonian people. And next thing you know, there's a lot of food and wine, prostitution, temples. I'm just saying it all to
Oh, yeah.
draw the line there, might have been. That was
Yes.
the last thing.
Yes, and David's point is great. If you don't draw the line early, then you become involved in other things. It just, that's where they were. They were not going to be corrupted by Babylon, but they would be servants of Babylon.
There's a lot of cultures in the world,
Yes,
and they're all not bad, but you have to adapt to the culture based on the Word of God for people to hear you. But here in this case, they were going against everything God taught. So culture itself changes, but God's Word does not change.
and that's where we are in this point.
Right.
Many of you wouldn't have thought some of the things that you hear in the news
Can't believe it.
would be accepted. Culture changes, but God's message does not. Okay, I'm done.
Thank you.
Thank you.